Thank you all for coming and spending your Tuesday night here. I just wanted to sort of define affirmative action as it stands under the current state of the law, give you a little idea of the program and of the conversation we're going to have. And, we very deliberately wanted to call it a conversation, not a debate, but it's a conversation with both sides and both views. It's not something that often happens within the Asian American community, so we're proud that we're able to do that, and we're glad that Asia Society is a host for it. Because, the Asian American community is an imagined one. It's an imagined political community, so you have to work to be part of it. It's not part of the mainstream, so it doesn't have a public square in which to exchange views and to have conversations and develop these ideas. So we're hoping that programs like this model what is possible. So with that being said, affirmative action, when it began at the beginning of the civil rights movement, was essentially racial set-asides. It began with, in the education space, 10 seats for black students. That's what it was. And then it generated a lawsuit that we know as Bakke versus University of California Regents, and it was a medical school admission case. And what came out of Bakke in 1978 was that racial set-asides were unconstitutional. You couldn't have that. And what came out of that was that you could still use race, not as the predominant factor, but as one factor in the service of diversity to make your decision in terms of educational admissions. And that was a compromise that the Supreme Court fashioned in 1978. And roughly, that is the construct under which we have traveled up to this point. And up to this point now, affirmative action as a legal construct is under threat and is under attack. And we're talking about the Harvard case. The Students for Fair Admissions, which was run by Edward Blum, is the organization that brought a complaint against Harvard. And for us, Asian Americans have really come to the forefront in terms of that public speech. Asian Americans are not used to being in the middle of mainstream talking about it. So it's a really critical moment for our community to have that conversation. And to that end, we're going to begin with a short presentation by Professor Van Tran, who's done, along with Jennifer Lee from Columbia, really important research that will lay the table for us as we understand the Asian American community and how it sees affirmative action. And then we're going to all come back up on stage, and we're going to hear very short comments from Jack Ouyang and from Nicole, Ochi, and then we're going to have a conversation. And then after that, we're going to have a conversation with you, where you can have your questions. I only ask that during the question and answer period that you ask questions, and that it not be a moment to have a platform to speak. We want you to speak through your questions. So with that, Professor Van Tran, if you could come up and give your presentation.
Okay, dear friends, welcome. My thanks to the Asia Society for having us here for this important debate. My talk today is drawn from shared work with Jennifer Lee, my colleague at Columbia. And as you all know, we are here to talk about the Harvard case. Last October, when the Harvard case went to trial, I asked Jennifer, what do we know about what average Asian Americans think about the policy? What does the empirical research show us about their support for or their opposition to the policy? And the answer is we do not know. And that really launched us on this journey of trying to just document the tremendous diversity in opinions and positions within the Asian American community. And that's what I'm going to show you today. For a long, long time, affirmative action policy is framed in mostly black and white terms. So where do Asians fit? And when we think about the Asian American community, there is tremendous diversity by nativity, for example. 2/3 of the Asian population are foreign-born. And if you were to look at just the adult population, then the number is 4/5. Second, they're also often stereotyped as the model minority, and this is not removed from some reality. They are only 6.4% of the total US population, and yet they account for, on average, 20 to 24% of the undergraduate population at some of our elite institutions across the country, from Harvard to Princeton and Yale, and the numbers vary from 18% to 24%. Third, there's a long history to how Asian Americans think about the policy. On the one hand, many Asian Americans came from countries where the only criterion for getting admission into college is meritocracy. The idea that testing, and testing well, is the only reason why you should be admitted, has really informed their views about college admissions, as you will hear later on. At the same time, some Asian Americans who were here in the US in the 1960s remembered the collective memory of the civil rights movement, the struggle for equality, where Asian Americans fought alongside Blacks and Latinos for equal rights. And those memories inform their support for this policy because they recognize the inequities between blacks and whites going back to the historical legacy of slavery. And finally, there is diversity by ethnicity, by ideology. Asian Americans are not just Democrats or Republicans, but in fact, most of them are independent, and therefore they don't have well-formed opinions about this policy. And of course, social class background as well. So what do we know about support for the policy? This is summarizing probably 25 years of research in just one slide. One, we know that demographics matter. Younger people, more educated individuals, women, minority, Democrats are more likely to support the policy compared to the other demographic groups. Second, it depends on what the policies are meant to do and whom the policies are meant to benefit. So, for example, if you think carefully about the policy at its origin, it was meant to actually also benefit women alongside Blacks and Latinos. So the more groups that are being designated as the intended beneficiary of the policy, the more support there generally is for the policy. Third, it depends on whether or not we're talking about admission to colleges and universities or affirmative action policy in the workplace, which is a different topic altogether. And finally, framing matters. And this is why how we approach the conversation really matters in terms of shoring up support or shoring up opposition to the policy. For example, Americans are very, very much in favor of equal opportunity, but not happy about equal outcomes. So when it's framed as equal opportunity for all, the support goes up significantly. When it's framed as providing access instead of increasing the number of students on campuses, again, support is higher for the former framing and lower for the latter framing. So our contribution is really very simple. Do Asians fit alongside white or alongside blacks on these issues? And we're going to show you some basic stats about differences by racial groups and ethnic groups. We are more interested also in the social psychological factors underlying the support for the policy. And more importantly, we're going to get into these details in the conversation. And finally, we are trying to play around with what we call experimental frames and try to see whether we are framing it one way or the other might matter for the level of support. The data we are drawing is from the 2016 National Asian American Survey, which is the most recent nationally representative survey in the country that has 10 Asian groups, conveyed in 10 ethnic languages because many of Asian Americans are first-generation immigrants who don't speak English. A third is cell phone, 2/3 are landlines. In addition to the Asian sample, we also have white, blacks, and Latinos as well because we want to compare how Asians fare vis-a-vis the other racial groups. These are the topics in the survey, and in so many ways, the survey mirrors very closely the American Community Survey in terms of the demographics. As you could see, the high school grad, the proportion female, and the proportion immigrant in the survey and in the ACS. And the survey is available online in case you are interested, any grad students or students in the room. So here's what we're trying to do with this framing. This is the standard question that we use in the general social survey to ask about support for the policy. And I would leave you to read that, except to highlight the yellow part, which is that this question is asking about the increase of the number of black students on campus. And then in a second frame, we ask the same question, but instead of just the number of black students, we say number of black and some Asian American students. And we wanted to see whether support would shift with this slightly different frame. And the response category is a 5-point scale from strongly opposed on the one hand and strongly favor on the other hand. Here is the first set of findings. And for this purpose, we're collapsing strongly support with support and strongly opposed with opposed. So that we have 3 categories. Support in blue, neutral, no opinion in yellow, and opposed in green. And this is just the number of black students. And what you see here is what we have known for quite some time now. Blacks are twice as likely as whites and Asians to support the policy. 71.3% compared to 39 and 37%. Latinos are slightly more than whites and Asians, but less than blacks to support the policy. More importantly, if you look closely at the yellow segment of these bars, what you are seeing is 31.7% of Asians, almost 1/3, have no opinion about this policy. And this again reflects the diversity among the community that we will unpack in a couple more slides. The second frame here that we have basically has the same question, but now it's about black and some Asian American students. And what you are seeing is the following: polarization. And here's how. Look at the black columns. 85% are now supportive of the policy compared to only 71.3% in the first condition. This is consistent with the idea that the more groups that will be benefiting from the policy, the more support we should have. At the same time, white and Asians also increased their support compared to the first conditions. However, if you look at the green segment, which is the opposition, whites and Asians are also more likely to oppose affirmative action policy when it's framed in this way, compared to 38% and 31% in the first condition. Are you still with me so far with these numbers? Yes? And finally, what you are seeing here is that Latinos, our control case, behave exactly as they should. What does it mean? You could see that there's no differences at all in terms of the framing. And this is as it should be because Latinos are not being included or invoked in the language of framing. And Latinos are sort of just there by themselves. And that gives us some internal validity about the survey framing that we have. So bottom line is we know blacks are more likely to support the policy than whites and Asians. What about Asians, Americans as a whole? This is not a monolith. There are lots of different ethnic groups, and here is the 10 ethnic groups that we happen to have in the 2016 NAS survey. And this is for the very first time that we have data to break them down by ethnic origin. For a long, long time, the discussion is always about Asian Americans think this, blacks think that. But among Asians, what we are finding is differences within the Asian American community is often larger than the differences between Asians and non-Asians. And here, what you are seeing is the blue line in the middle, 43.1%, which is the average support for Asian Americans overall. And what you are seeing is the Chinese, the Hmongs, and the Vietnamese are slightly less supportive of the policy compared to the average. But the Koreans, for example, are off the chart in terms of the level of support. So I want to draw your attention to Chinese and Korean because that actually represent the two extremes. Only 30% of the Chinese support the policy, whereas 62% of the Koreans do so. More importantly, again, look at the yellow. It's roughly 1 in 5, if not 1 in 3, Asian Americans from each ethnic group had no opinion about the policy because many of them, again, are first-generation immigrants. And the level of opposition is also quite high. The first 6 groups, Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese, all together comprise 84% of the total US Asian population. Yes, we have many smaller groups, and including groups that we don't have here, like the Laotians, and other small Asian groups, but they are really a teeny fraction of the Asian American community. So when you think about the Chinese, for example, what you're seeing is the polarization that is often being portrayed in the media. Progressive Chinese who are very supportive of the policy, and also conservative Chinese who are strongly anti-affirmative action policy because they believe that it discriminates against Asian Americans. And this data point shows that very, very clearly. And the 27.9% who have no opinion is really swayable in the sense that depending on how you frame it, they might come closer to one side or the other. So let's juxtapose these 2 East Asian groups, Chinese versus Koreans, and think a little bit about why one is so supportive and the other one is so not supportive of the policy. Well, first of all, group size matters, we argue in our work, because Chinese Americans comprise 24% of all Asian Americans in the US. What does it mean in real terms? It means that their children are most likely to be impacted by this policy. On average, right? 1 out of 4 applicants who are Asian Americans will be Chinese, and therefore they are the one community that feel the most impact by the policy. They're also the most polarized groups, as I have shown you previously, and they're also most mobilized. And this is interesting, and this is a recent development, and maybe Jack and Nicole can educate us more as to why that mobilization has been really effective in, again, arguing for and also against the policy as the lawsuit went to trial. In contrast, when you think about Korean Americans, we argue that intergroup relations matter, and we're picking these 2 cases as sort of the highlight to sort of give you a sense of how the rest might be fitting in. Many Korean Americans are grocers who open grocery stores in black neighborhoods, and they have much better intergroup relationship with blacks. And therefore, they have more positive attitude towards blacks and more likely to understand the historical legacy of inequality that affected blacks, and therefore more likely to be supportive of the policy than otherwise. Let me now summarize and end with a few thoughts, and then I'll hand it over to the entire panel. The first thing I want you to walk away remembering is framing matters, because we are actually using very subtle frames. We're just using just one edition of the Asian American as an intended beneficiary group, and yet we see a big shift in the level of support. So how we talk about affirmative action policy really matters, and we have to be very careful with the language and how we speak about it. Second, those who think that inequality across groups, across different individuals, are a matter of individual drive and motivation and hard work, are less likely to support the policy. In contrast, those who believe that the historical inequality of wealth and the historical segregation between blacks and whites meant that blacks had less access to good education than white are much more likely to support the policy. Third, there is this fascinating interplay between what we call perceived self-interest and group interest, right? If the policy benefits me, then I should be supportive of it, or else being equal. But at the same time, if the policy benefits my own group, I should also be supportive of it as well. So there is this group versus self-interest that are sort of driving the support, and in some sense, this is most obvious among blacks, because what we haven't shown you is results from a different set of analyses whereby we asked blacks if we were to include Asians alongside blacks, do they support affirmative action policy? Controlling for everything else, blacks are no more or less likely than white and Asians and Latinos to support the policy once Asians are included as the intended beneficiary in a multivariate context. So that really is interesting. And affirmative action policy obviously has everything to do with diversity, as Chris has alluded to earlier. And I think the importance of diversity in a diversifying and multi-ethnic society we're in right now is more crucial than ever before, especially in a more globalized and interconnected world. And finally, I just want to say that the debate today, or the conversation today, is about the centrality of race in holistic admission. Should race be considered or should race be removed? And why should we include race and why should we remove it from the consideration of admission? And I invite all of you, and I know you all have thoughts about this, and hopefully we can have a conversation. But before I end, I just want to leave you with one quote that I find very helpful as I navigate this entire conversation. And this is from the former New York Senator, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and he said, everyone is entitled to his opinion, his or her opinion, but not to his or her own facts. And this is important as we think about this debate, because facts are facts and opinions are deeply personal and deeply held. And these are two very different dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for that really timely research. And, you know, in the Asian American community, there is very little knowledge about the Asian American community outside of it. And that's really, you know, one of the things that we think is really important about this panel. Because just like Tom said, when people looked at the program and they saw Asian American and they saw all Asian American faces, they go, oh, everyone's going to think the same thing. But if you're in it and you're engaged, you know that's just not the case. So I think that it might be useful for each person, Jack and Nicole, to start maybe with the history of your organization and then what you're trying to do with that organization. So I think that would be a really great way to begin. So Jack, if you could start, tell us about Asian American Coalition for Education.
Yeah, Asian American Coalition for Education, it's a grassroots organization. We fight against for equal education right for all the Asian Americans and all Americans. We started the organization back to 2015.
And you know, what has it done in terms of, once you got together, what have you guys been doing in terms of the Harvard case?
We've done a lot of things. In 2015, we filed an administrative complaint against Harvard with Department of Education and the Department of Justice. And in last year, DOJ started investigating Harvard for their discrimination against Asian Americans. In 2016, we filed another administrative complaint against Yale, Dartmouth, and other universities. So last year, DOJ and OCR started investigating Yale and other universities for their discrimination against Asian Americans. It's last year too. In the Harvard case, we united more than 200 Asian American organizations and we filed an amicus brief to support the plaintiff.
That's right. Thank you. And Nicole, you are from Asian Americans Advancing Justice. If you want to talk a little bit about its history and also what it has done in terms of the Harvard case.
Sure. So hi everyone, my name's Nicole. I'm an attorney at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. We were formerly known as the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, so some of you may know us by that name. And we were founded in 1984 by a civil rights activist to address the gap in terms of advocacy for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the Southern California area. And one of the motivating factors for our founding was the killing of Vincent Chin. And we've long been involved in defending affirmative action. We are based in California, so we were the first state that encountered an initiative to ban affirmative action. So we're really involved in trying to fight that initiative using litigation and on the ground. Unfortunately, we lost that litigation, but we did file a case against UC Berkeley, which was the premise for the holistic admissions policy that the UCs use today. And we have since been involved in filing amicus briefs at the Supreme Court level in all of the major affirmative action cases. And in the Harvard case, we represented we represented many, but 4 of our individual students testified at the trial, and we had the opportunity to deliver opening and closing statements.
So both organizations.
And just to be clear, in favor of affirmative action, our students testified in favor of affirmative action.
That's right. That's right. So back to you, Jack. What is the eventual goal of AAC? What would it like to see happen as a result of the Harvard case?
The Harvard case, our goal is to make sure everybody in this country, regardless their race, Asian American, African American, Hispanic American, everybody has equal education rights.
Now, we went through a little bit of the history, and obviously you know the history of our country in terms of why at a certain point in the 60s there was a need, or people felt there was a need for affirmative action. They felt that it was important because of the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, of legalized discrimination. And affirmative action was one remedy for that. And then it sort of got fed through Bakke, and then it was sort of within the legal construct, in the name of diversity, that's how affirmative action, or parts of it, was kept, in the use of race. Is that something that you think is no longer necessary, the use of race?
Let me be clear. AACE, we do not oppose affirmative action. We do oppose race-based college admission policies. So, in terms of the race, we oppose all sorts of discrimination against anybody, everybody, because we saw a lot of discrimination is every day and everywhere. In terms of the race, we think a lot of race used, Supreme Court has a lot of rulings back to 78, 93, so it's bar use racial quotas in college admission. It's bar by the racial stereotype. It's by use higher education standard. I think a lot of top colleges, they violate the Supreme Court ruling. They abuse the race-based college admission policies. That's why, and the Asian Americans are mostly harmed and discriminated by the race-based college policies. That's why we think we should get rid of it.
So coming out of discovery, there was, I think AACE really talked about how Asian Americans were rated the lowest in terms of their personality. That was the sort of charge coming out of a very famous New York Times article about it. Is that what you're talking about? You feel like Asian Americans are getting hurt on that particular, and that is a cover to discriminate against Asian Americans?
That's just one of the factors, or one of the symptoms Asian Americans get discriminated. Mm-hmm. That's one piece is racial stereotype. Harvard consistently rate Asian American applicants lowest in personal rating. Mm-hmm. So that's racial stereotype. The other one is racial quotas. Run-ons had studies shows during past 20 years, Asian American college-age population has doubled, but the admission rate in Ivy schools has been basically flat for the past 20 years. That's indicated existence of racial quotas in the system. The third one is higher standard. There are surveys by inside higher education a few years ago. More than 39% of the admission officers from both private and public colleges, they admit they hold Asian American students with higher standard. The professor from Princeton, his study revealed that for Asian to get into top colleges, you have to score more than 140 points higher than white student, 270 points than Hispanic student, and 450 points than African American student. That's a clear indication of higher standard. Based on above 3 points, I think Asian Americans getting discriminated, and the top colleges, they abused the system.
So Nicole, that's a summary of the charges that the other side has sort of argued with. Where does the side you're representing come out on those charges?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm a little bit confused, Jack. Sorry, is it okay if I do this?
Yeah.
So you say that you don't oppose affirmative action, but you level these different charges. So I'm just interested, what do you want to see changed about Harvard's admissions process?
It's simple. Do not consider race. I don't think, for a student, there are many things could be a merit for them. Your high school GPA, your test score, your community service, your leadership, you overcome burdens, hardship, all those things, I think those are merit for a student or for applicants. I just don't say race is the merit. Your color of your skin is the merit. If ever the skin, your race should be a plus factor, like Van mentioned before, a plus factor. That's true for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans. That's not true for Asian American students. Actually, for Asian American students, it's a minus factor in college admissions. That's why many college consultants suggest Asian students do not check the Asian box in your application form.
Okay.
So did you want to follow up? Yeah.
Sure. So thank you for clarifying. So I think our position is that race should be considered in the admissions process, and the reason for that is manyfold. But before I go into that, I think I need to acknowledge that affirmative action, as it currently stands, is a very, very limited policy. And all of us, Asian Americans, and anyone who really cares about racial justice in our country should do much more than defend affirmative action. We need to get to the root causes of systemic racism in our country. Okay, but we're talking about affirmative action today, so I will talk about why we defend affirmative action. 3 reasons. Number 1, it is the right thing to do. Let's think about what affirmative action does in the current context. Number 1, it allows students to portray themselves holistically, and that is the whole point of holistic admissions. Without your race, how can you show all of who you are? And that benefits not just Black and brown students, but also Asian American students. It is also important to consider race because traditional admissions criteria undervalue the merit of underrepresented minority students. And we should all care about that because the grades and the test scores and even the extracurricular activities, these do not determine whether someone will be a success in life and whether or not they will be contributing members of society. And so when there is extensive research that proves that these traditional measures undervalue the success of students, then we need to take race into account because these are racialized measures. Number 2, we support affirmative action because there is no evidence that it hurts Asian Americans, and there's a lot of evidence that it benefits them. So it doesn't hurt Asian Americans. Let's just think about Asian Americans in higher education, or even at just Harvard for a minute. 25% of the admitted class for the class of 2023 was Asian American. Even before this lawsuit, starting from 2010, there's been an increase of Asian Americans in terms of admission to Harvard by, I believe, 27%. And so this is not consistent with the idea of discrimination, that Asian Americans are getting shut out of these hallowed halls of Harvard. Also, if you look at both the evidence on Harvard and larger studies of elite universities, even if African American and Latino students didn't apply at all to any of these schools, the chances of an Asian American student to get in would increase by less than 1%. So getting rid of affirmative action is not even the solution to increase Asian American admit rates, if that's your goal. And in terms of benefiting Asian Americans, there is a lot of evidence that affirmative action or the consideration of race does benefit Asian Americans. In California, where I'm from, after Prop 209, where we couldn't consider race anymore, Asian American admit rates declined more than general admit rates declined. Also, there's a lot of research that shows low-income Asian Americans do better under a race-conscious admissions policy than under a race-neutral one. There's also underrepresented Asian American groups because we are not a monolith, Asian America. And for those individuals or for those subgroups that are underrepresented, this kind of policy allows colleges to see that a Hmong student, a Cambodian student, a Pacific Islander student brings a different perspective than an East Asian student, for example, and therefore would benefit the larger campus community. I would also say that there's a lot of evidence from the Harvard case itself that Asian Americans benefit individually. The two students that you saw in Van's first picture, those are my clients, Sally and Tang, and both of them disclosed their race and talked extensively about their race in their admissions files, and that was looked upon favorably, and they testified about that. And I feel like I'm running along, so I'm going to just keep it really short. My third point is, I think when we think about why we should defend affirmative action, I think we have to look at the long game and the cost and benefit. What do you gain from getting rid of affirmative action? Almost nothing. Less than 1% increase. And these students who few students who might get into Harvard that wouldn't have otherwise gotten in, they probably would have gotten into Penn or Brown or somewhere else and have bright futures ahead of them. But what do you lose? You lose your cross-racial solidarity. You lose the very people that you need to fight for a better world for all of us. And just using a really specific example, I think all communities of color can probably get behind fighting legacies, which compounds centuries of white admissions advantage. But who is going to want to stand with you if you're fighting against policies that benefit other communities of color, including Asian Americans? And also, I think you're wasting a lot of energy if you're fighting against affirmative action that you could be using on fighting much bigger problems that Asian Americans face. Because I agree with you, Jack, that Asian Americans do face a lot of discrimination. We can look at the scientists, not spies issues. We can look at the bamboo ceiling, the representation in the media. All of these things are really important that we need to fight. And we could use all of the resources that you are pouring into the fight against affirmative action to fight those larger issues.
So I want to pick up on your point about legacy admissions. I have personally felt that it was something that really enabled white applicants over Asian American applicants for a long time, but really didn't see sort of the left lead that fight, up until now. So is that a failure of the Asian American left, so to speak, in terms of not speaking about legacy earlier? Because maybe if it had, call it conservative, and maybe you don't want the label, but let's say the conservative movement wouldn't have arisen as a result. So has that been a failure? How do we deal with that? Can we unite against an effort to remove legacy? Either.
Yeah, definitely. I think legacy is I think that's a lot of big issues we have to fight against. It's not fair. Everybody knows that. But it's a much tougher battle because there is, as far as I know, with the preliminary research we did, there is no existing law to ban that. On the other hand, for race-based admissions, there are tons of Supreme Court rulings. There are tons of researches has been done. There are many facts there. So I'm not saying we are not going to fight legacy. I think we can unite on that front to do that sometime, later.
Nicole, did you want to speak about legacy, and then Professor Van Tran? Yeah.
I suppose you could perhaps, I guess you could call it a failure of the left, but I also feel like the left, or at least organizations like mine, have been very focused on serving the needs of low-income Asian Americans, and legacies really affect, elite institutions. And although we feel like we need to step in when things like race-conscious admissions policies are under attack, it's not, our priorities are not to, focus on that 1% of students, right? We're more worried about the state of public schools, community colleges, those kinds of things.
Priorities.
Sure.
Professor?
So I would just add 2 comments. The first is legacy admission really is now increasingly benefiting Asian Americans, believe it or not, because the second generation Asian Americans who grew up in the 1980s, who went into all of these elite colleges.
Okay, we are not uniting to fight legacy anymore. This is not
actually sending their children to the same universities. And that actually is beginning to benefit not just whites, but Asians. And that's something we have to think about. The intergenerational transmission of advantages and disadvantages. The second point I make is actually very, very technical, but it's important in this entire debate on legacies, which is that I have yet to see a scientific study that shows clearly, despite obviously the kind of the scandal about admission at USC and beyond, that separate the impact of social class privilege and reproduction versus the genetic inheritance and the cultivation of intellectual capacity just because you have 2 parents who happen to be Harvard educated. And legacy as a category group those 2 separate groups together in one. And the first I oppose to, but the second is just a natural byproduct of the fact that if I have 2 PhD parents from Harvard, I ought to have a better chance of getting in because I knew my vocabulary at the age of 3 and not age of 5. And that is a different form of advantages, but it's not the same as the first one, which is you get in just because your parents attended one elite institution. And that, I think, is really important. And in the big debate, we have sort of lumped them. And I do not like that from the standpoint of scientific accuracy.
And we are one of the few countries in the world to have legacy. Because obviously, if you know the history of legacy and multi-factor admissions, it comes back to a very sort of sordid racist history that is at the root of these programs. And we are unique in that way, and maybe not better unique. So Jack, did you want to have something? I know Nicole had some time, so I wanted to make sure you had a chance to respond to any points that she had raised.
Yeah. Since Nicole mentioned the percentage of the Harvard, let's take Harvard as the example. You mentioned the admission percentage for Asians has increased, reached to around 25%. And you claim Asian Americans are not discriminated. So I want to ask you, what do you think is a good percentage for Asian American students in Harvard?
What do I think is a good percentage? Oh,
Yes.
I don't really think about that, I suppose. I don't think about things in terms of percentages. I just think about things in terms of, are we looking at the whole person, and are we taking into account the systemic disadvantages that some students experience? And that's what I want to preserve, regardless of what the outcome is.
If I could add a footnote to this, because numbers are my terrain,
Yeah.
I'll just say this. Jack started by saying that the number of college-age Asian applicants have doubled over the last 15, 20 years, and yet the proportion of Asian Americans at elite institutions have stayed constant. But there's another variable in that, which is that not all of those college-age Asian American applicants apply to Harvard or Princeton or Yale. So the fact that the college-age population of Asians have doubled does not immediately translate into the number of Asian Americans at Harvard ought to be double as well. So that's the first point. Second point, when we talk about admission into Harvard, there are three different numbers that we need to look at very carefully and not just one. The number of applicants or proportion of Asians who are part of the applicant pool, the number who actually got admitted into Harvard as a proportion of the admission, the admitted class, and third, the yield rate and the actual number of Asians who decided to come to Harvard. Because it could very well be that Harvard admitted them, but they decided Yale is better, or UCLA, or UC Berkeley is better, and therefore they turn Harvard down. So when we look at these numbers, we really have to dig deep in order to get the accurate numbers as to what proportions of Asians are represented at Harvard or Yale. And the best data I see internally from Harvard and being graphed by the Harvard Coalition for the Diverse Harvard show that the proportion of Asian Americans admitted, okay, not enrolled, admitted, has been rather stable yet fluctuating dramatically from year to year, which is evidence to my mind against a racial quota towards Asian Americans at Harvard. And that, I think, is really, really important to take into account.
So, Jack, I wanted to push you, return to an earlier question that Nicole had asked you about. So you support affirmative action, some form of affirmative action?
Yes.
But based on socioeconomic. Is that the point?
Yes.
I see.
Our policy, we have the three or four policies from AAC. I want to share with you guys. The number one is we support diversity in school campus. But we don't think the issue, the way to achieve diversity is not used in race. So, the root cause of for the diversity is affirmative action does not address the root cause. The root cause is at K to 12 educations. We need to improve that. That's the root cause. That's not at the college level. That's our position number one. Position number two is our goal is to support equal education rights for all groups, not only Asian Americans, not only African Americans, including Hispanic Americans, including white too. Number three, our position is we support economic-based affirmative action or economic status-based college admissions, because we believe Asians are most discriminated by the current policies, and the current policy does not help African American or Hispanic American at all. Since its implementation for more than 50 years, the socio-economic, the achievement gap among racial groups has not narrowed. It's actually much bigger. Then all the representation of African Americans in top colleges actually has dropped compared to 35 years ago. So we believe the current policy is a failing policy and does not help anybody.
So the major critique of socioeconomic-based race-neutral or race-blind admissions is that in America, we have never been blind to race. That it is the original sin of the American nation. It's been there. It's in the laws. It's in our society. There's just no way to take that out of the equation. That's the critique of sort of a race neutral. I mean, how do you deal with that notion that there's just no way to take race out? Because of our history as Americans, we have to deal with it. But
I would just point to empirical evidence that already exists. Take Michigan. After the kind of ending of consideration of race as part of the admission process, Michigan has become significantly less diverse. So if race is not part of the equation, what we will end up is significantly more white campuses across the board. And we see that also at the UT system, whereby we have seen implementation of sort of, top 10% of every high school across the state shall be admitted to the flagship colleges. And there, what you are seeing is the lack of consideration of race, but the result of that has always been more white, and in fact, I would even argue more Asian American students, and very, very few blacks and Hispanic. And the Asian American part came from MIT and Caltech, two selective institutions that refuse to take race into consideration. And there, the proportion of Asians are 40%, 50%, instead of 25% at Harvard, right? And is that the right way to go? I would argue not, because we don't have to go far to see the impact. Just come back to New York City and look at Stuyvesant. Last year, only 8 or 9 black students were admitted. And this is based on one entrance exam without any consideration of race. The result of not considering race is that we're going to end up with a less diverse group of students at every single level, regardless of what we do with class, with other consideration. And therefore, race is and shall remain central for a long time, because race correlates with class, with other personality ratings, and with everything else in our society, in multiple domains, from the most private to the most public, from residential segregation to wealth inequality, to school quality, to the type of neighborhood you live in, and to the type of friends that you have and the networks that you have, which might give you an advantage or might hold you back. So race permeates everything, and that's why race has to and continues to be central in this process.
Jack?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, in the college admission, I think race can be used as a plus factor. But in the current system, race is a plus factor for all other minority groups but Asian Americans. For me, that's purely discrimination. Like I mentioned before, we oppose discriminations. But to remediate past discrimination, you cannot do it by create new discrimination against another group. That's wrong. And let me say one more thing. There is a Pew Research Center survey, which is conducted this year, 2019. 73% of Americans says college should not use race in their admission process. That includes 62% of African Americans and 59% of Asian Americans. That says how American people think about the issue.
Thank you. Did you want to say something before I go to the Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just really quickly to address your point that the consideration of race does not benefit Asian Americans. I don't think there's any proof of that. As someone who's looked at all the evidence in the Harvard case, my clients, who are pictured up there, were beneficiaries of a race-conscious admissions program. And I want to just point out something. So one of my students got a lower than average SAT score. That was noted by the admissions officers. He himself thought he had zero chance of getting into Harvard, but it was the consideration of race and the diversity that he brought that allowed him to get in, because he wrote all in his essay about what it was to be a Vietnamese immigrant who was bullied for his English language acquisition and for his race, and how that made him distance himself from his identity, and then how he learned to reclaim it and be proud of being Vietnamese. And it was because he wrote about that, not just because of that. He was a valedictorian and all these other things, right? Like, that's the other thing about affirmative action, right? You have to be qualified to get in. So anyway, I think there's no evidence that categorically Asian Americans are not benefiting from affirmative action.
I think we won't settle that question here, but maybe we can get to a little in the Q&A, if that's all right.
Just want to say that real quick. Okay. I believe you claim 1 or 2 students to get into Harvard or other top university, they deserve it. But we are not looking at the individual level, individual student level. We are looking at the systematic discrimination against Asians. 1 or 2 or 10, even 100 students cannot, the data for those cannot say anything. In the Harvard case, we have 160,000 student data. That will tell us if there's discrimination or not. That's in the hand of the court. We will see.
I'm going to come to the Q&A. Sorry, I know we're getting into that, but I'm sure the Q&A will be very, very gentle. And I don't know, gentleman in the front.
Hi. This question is directed to primarily both Nicole and Jack. I'm wondering if the conversation about affirmative action is presenting sort of a little bit of a false dichotomy in that there's either affirmative action or there's not. Whereas the dialogue might be a little bit better suited if you consider there's something positive for Black and Hispanic applicants on the one hand, which might be better for society as a whole, and an Asian penalty, which I think everyone might agree is a bad thing for colleges to apply to applicants, as opposed to a dichotomy where it's only affirmative action or no affirmative action at all.
So I agree with you that there has been a confusion in the narrative about 2 very separate issues. One, the viability, the constitutionality of an affirmative action program that considers race as one of many factors to achieve racial diversity in higher education. And that's very different from whether or not Asian Americans are discriminated against vis-a-vis whites. And both claims exist in Harvard, and I think the narrative has been confused. My position is that, without a doubt, Harvard's program is constitutional. It's a race-conscious admissions program. And I also don't believe that Harvard is intentionally discriminating against Asian Americans vis-a-vis whites. And I can go into those reasons or not, but no. Chris says no, so I won't go into those reasons. But I do want to highlight one thing. I am not disputing that there is implicit bias in the admissions process, because there is an implicit bias throughout all of society. What I take issue with is singling out Asian Americans as the only victims of that. Black, brown, and Asian American students are victims of stereotyping and implicit bias that limits their opportunities in terms of education and employment. And it's not just Harvard doing that, right? It's happening at the K through 12 level. It's happening in the employment sector. It's happening everywhere. So I don't like how we're just privileging Asian Americans above any other group that's affected by that problem.
Like I mentioned before, I agree we should help all those disadvantaged communities, regardless the African American or Asian Americans. Or we want to make sure everybody has equal education rights. Or actually, AACE, not too long ago, we issued a press release to support an African American parents group in Hartford, Connecticut, for their fight against racial quotas in local school. So our ultimate goal is to make sure everybody have equal education right, including Asian Americans.
I'm going to go with a question from the internet. Jason from New York asks, why is the Asian American community so divided on this issue?
It's because we're very diverse as a community. And it's because, the class diversity in particular among the Chinese community really drives that polarization. So for those of you who might not know, Chinese immigrants post-1965 have been mostly bimodal. Lots of very highly educated PhD and JDs and MDs. And then the garment workers, the restaurant workers who basically work in Chinatown. And that bimodality mapped onto support for and opposition against the policy. Because the working class Chinese and the working class Vietnamese, the true students I pictured, recognize the importance of this policy in giving them a chance. Whereas the upper middle class or upper class Chinese students are now competing against white applicants directly. And here is the conundrum. And here I am actually speaking in support of Jack. I'm an academic, so I'm very neutral on this topic. I would say this. Asian Americans are often known as the non-minority minority. What does it mean? It means that we're in a bind. We have higher levels of education and income compared to white for decades already, not just now. Since the 1980s, you look back historically at census data, Asian Americans as a group have always done better than white when it comes to the objective measures. So therefore, unlike Hispanics and blacks, who we see are deserving of support because of the disadvantaged position that they hold, Asians are simply just sort of the minority group that don't seem to fit this majority-minority paradigm. And here is where I would end, which is that Asians, on the one hand, lack the cultural privilege of whiteness. At the same time, they also lack the historical legitimacy of blackness. And therefore, that is the bind that Asian Americans are in. And this is at the core of why we are going back and forth as to whether or not Asians should be or should not be counted as a POC and or considered honorary white. And this is an ongoing debate.
And this is why we have a sociologist with us. And grappling with these basic premise assumptions really helps guide us on where you might end up on these questions. So we think that if you're confused, there's a reason why you're confused, because the racial sort of categories is a socially created category that is confusing. And if you don't stop to think about it critically, you're just going to become a cog in that machine. And I would think the one thing I would add to that as a lawyer is law has really shaped how the Asian American community is. And by that I mean the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. You have Asians or Chinese immigration beginning with the gold rush in big numbers to the West Coast, and then it stops with 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it expands to bar all other Asians. And it does not come down until 1965. So what you have is at the beginning of the Asian American movement, you have the children and grandchildren of the original people, mostly Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino. And then post-65, you have an entirely new immigration from the same countries. But they're separated by time, distance, language, and so we are all then come in and we're like, oh, we're all Asian Americans, but they're really separated by time, distance, and law. And I think that explains, in addition to what the professor has told us, about the huge differences in our community. So I think that we need to understand these things that create the circumstances under which we operate so that we can have a conversation here without casting aspersions, which is really what I see a lot in our community. And I would just encourage debate to and self-exploration. So sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. I see a lot of hands. Peter in the middle.
Let me ask you a question. Chris, the whole concept of affirmative action when I grew up was to be able to go to college. You're a son of an immigrant, daughter of an immigrant. You basically can pay your bills. And the American dream is to go to college. But all you guys keep talking about, how come we can't get to Harvard? I mean, it's kind of funny, that the fact that you could get into college. City College was a perfect example for the smart Asian Americans. Their parents couldn't afford the tuition. Harvard Club is a country club. You go there and you hang out with the Kennedy family or the Nixon family. But you guys missed the whole boat. The fact that the affirmative action is for Asian Americans to get into college and then go out into their life. Why doesn't anybody talk about that instead of Harvard or UP? And you were right, Professor. A blue-collar, working-class Chinese versus upper-middle-class Chinese think differently.
Oh, I think that's a common misunderstanding on AAC's position on this. Let me be clear. We don't encourage everybody to get to Harvard. Our position is each student should get into college if they like, whatever they like, and they can fit in. The reason we pick Harvard because it's the most prestigious college in this country. We want to make sure Harvard will conduct their admission process under the law. They cannot violate the law. They have to abide by Title VI of 1964 Civil Rights Act. They cannot discriminate anybody, including Asian Americans. That's the reason we pick Harvard. Not because we want everybody to get into Harvard. That's not even possible.
Another reason why Harvard is so central is the following. Harvard was really the holistic admission process that the University of California versus Bakke case pointed to as a model for holistic admission, which is why Harvard has always been under spotlight since 1978. But more to your point, I think you're exactly right. There has been, over the last 30 years in this country, a trend, and I call this trend the winner-take-all society. We are obsessed with the elite, with the most successful, with the best and brightest, and these labels often take away from the average American. And you think about, the recent election, you think about, college admissions, the best and brightest get into everywhere. And the rest, wait till they turn 15 other places down, and then that slot comes to you. And I dislike this. And it's true for college admission, it's true for grad school admission, it's true for assistant professorship position, it's true for everything else. And the other place where you see this manifest is on our Supreme Court. How is it that we are now only representing 3 institutions with 9 judges or 9 justices, whereas there was a time when a person with a law degree from Michigan could be appointed. And now it's almost impossible. And at least we haven't seen it for the last 15 years or so. So there is this confluence of event that led all of us to be obsessed with the elite institutions. And I myself personally dislike this because it distracts from the problems of the average Americans, as you pointed out, who are just trying to get by, who are just trying to put food on the table, who are just trying to get themselves educated. I was educated at CUNY, right here in this city, at a community college and then Hunter College. I would not have been able to afford to go to Columbia or Harvard because my parents simply would not have been able to pay for it. So I'm with you 100%. But we need to distract.
CUNY is in the top 3. CUNY, Hunter, and Baruch are the top 3 colleges in the nation for public education and are affordable. I'm a Hunter undergraduate too, and so is my daughter. So I agree with you.
Did you want to address the questions in any way, or?
I mean, I guess I just want to say that I also agree, and I think that's why we haven't had a strategy around legacy admissions, and I think I can hopefully speak for all civil rights groups. This is why we've been honestly a step behind on all of this elite admission stuff, because our priorities have not been who gets into Harvard. And so we're entering this because we're forced to enter it.
Okay. All right, so I haven't called on a female yet, but I just want some gender equity. All right.
I like Dr. Tran's quote, the quote you used just now, the opinions versus facts. But what we see in these debates are people on different sides hold different sets of facts. And those facts cannot persuade one another. So in this situation, what do you think is the solution?
It is a very sad situation to be in as an academic and a researcher. Facts are facts, social facts, But we live in an age whereby facts are constantly being distorted. We live in an age whereby, people often find the evidence and the fact in support of their position. And this is true actually for virtually every topic out there, from climate change to human trafficking. If you really dig deep, you will find a study somewhere that shows the benefit of or the disadvantages of human trafficking or climate change. And this is why the role of the research community is more crucial than ever before, because we must be neutral. And just in case you're wondering that elite institutions like Columbia, Harvard are, bastions of the elite who are progressive and left-leaning, let me assure you that in my classrooms, I always give both sides of the debate. However, I also say that the evidence overall, across multiple studies, weigh more heavily on this side over that side. And it is you, the audience, or my students, who get to decide for yourself what is the conclusion that you want to draw after consuming the facts that were in front of you. And that, I think, is an invitation for critical reflection and critical thinking from every citizen of this country, for every piece of fact that you consume. And I'll give you one very simple example. The graph I show you with the favor, oppose, and no opinion. The percentages of support versus opposition can change if you remove the yellow part and just recalculate it. And that is how the media can easily distort the numbers and say, well, Chinese are for or against the production policy, even though the numbers are the same. You have to read the fine print and say, oh, we excluded those who have no opinions. Well, on the one hand, you could say, yeah, they have no opinion, therefore I should exclude them. On the other hand, you say, well, they have no opinion, but they could one day become opinionated, and therefore they should be included. And that is the subtlety that we need to educate our students and our citizens to be aware of, and that's the only way we can fight the spreading of fake news and fake facts.
Yeah, Rocky. Oh, Rocky, you go.
Well, first of all, this I know is among a number of conversations we've been having, so I want to thank the Asia Society and the Bar Association for doing this, and hopefully we'll have more. I guess I wanted to just ask all of you to also comment on something that the moderator, Chris Kwok, said about the fact that the immigration law changed in '65 around the same time that affirmative action, which wasn't really a fully defined policy, also was initiated. Because what we haven't really talked about, and as an attorney, we oftentimes talk about the law and so forth, but we haven't talked about the movements that actually created the need really to address underrepresentation and the fact that our immigration law really was discriminatory. So I want to address that, because it seems like Professor, you were talking about the two different groups of Asian Americans, or Chinese Americans specifically. The early group, many of us did not know our history that much, frankly. I happen to be a child of an immigrant of the earlier group. And so during the 60s, we actually had to advocate for learning about that history in places like Harvard and Yale and so forth. And we still are advocating, frankly, for that, especially on the Ivy League schools, which is appalling, actually. It's another issue which we need to address. Why don't we learn this history? And why is that history really being kept? But I think we need to talk about that in these kind of conversations also, because one of the statistics that you mentioned, which I was kind of responding to, was the Korean statistics showing support. So I think that's a very interesting distinction. But on the other hand, it also makes me think of the experience we had during the riots in LA, where you actually had a very big split in terms of, and there's no automatic, Asians are supporting blacks and Latinos. There's, that is a movement, political movement kind of, or civil rights movement. So I think we need to think about that because that was a really horrendous split in the communities. And when we think about affirmative action and why, you're talking about you don't want to discriminate against Asian. I mean, I think we all don't want to have discrimination against Chinese or any other group. But we have to think about it in that context. So maybe you could respond a little bit to that.
I have a lot to say, but I want Nicole and Jack to go first.
Did the movements that fed the civil rights movement, that led to Asian America, led to the reform in the Civil Rights Act, how does that inform the policy decisions that we choose to advocate for? Or not?
Oh, definitely their impact. We know Asian Americans has been silent for many, many years. We are not famous for spoken out. So whenever you face discrimination or other issues, most people were just intern. The reason we get involved in this is because they are students back to 10 years ago from New Jersey, one student called Jian Li. He feared he got discriminated by Princeton. He filed an individual complaint to OCR. No response in 10 years. Back to 2013, another student, Michael Wang from California, he filed complaint against Princeton too, and no response. Back then, we feel like because they feel they don't have any support, just like African Americans, they have a NAACP. Asian Americans, we don't have anything, nobody supports them. That's why we, Asian American Coalition for Education, we step up. We feel if we unite more Asian organizations and to support them because we feel this is a very important issue, not just for us, it's for everybody. That's how we get involved on this. And we do have a lot of impact right now because it's such a critical issue.
I'm not sure if I quite understand the question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can move on to another question.
Oh, sorry.
Do we have time for one more question?
I can respond if you want.
Okay.
Let me just say 30 seconds, the history. We have to go back to 1924 when we basically passed the Immigration Restriction Act, barring entry of all non-white immigrants. And for 4 decades, except for the the refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, there was very little immigration into the U.S. from 1924 to 1965. And 1965 passed the Immigration Act that opened up the door to the non-white immigrants who arrived today, including my parents. 1965 Act of Immigration would not have been possible were it not for the Civil Rights Movement. These two movements were moving along in tandem. Because on the one hand, you look domestically and you said, we could no longer afford to discriminate against blacks, and they ought to be given the right to vote. On the other hand, we say, well, how could we have this racist immigration policy? We must abolish it as well. And that is the culmination of the 1960s. Those of you who come of age of that generation should be very proud because that generation did a lot of good things for this country. So that's my first point about the history and how that unfolded. But my second point is more consequential. The consequences of post-1965 immigration on elite admission is the following. That increasingly, the children of black immigrants from West Africa, from the West Indies, are taking the slot of the African Americans for whom affirmative action policy was designed in the first place. So you look at Harvard and Princeton, and they boast that they have 9% African American students in their incoming class. And you break that down by ethnic origin, you will see the underrepresentation of native-born blacks and overrepresentation of Nigerians and West Africans. And this is an issue that we don't talk about at all because the intraracial diversity among blacks. But that is a problem because this policy was designed first and foremost to address the inequities between blacks and whites. And that is where I feel very ambivalent about the impact of immigration. And this is why diversity of today is no longer just black and white, and no longer just black, white, Asian, Hispanic, but it's like multi-groups with various different types of advantages and disadvantages. So where do you begin, and how do you create a fair and a just society?
So I think that really a rethinking of affirmative action and how it works is really overdue. Now, we need to get together and have that conversation in a way that's measured, that is rooted in history, and that rethinks it in a way that benefits the society overall, as opposed to maybe just what we perceive to be self-interest. I don't know if that's sort of how we go, but is there time for one last question, and then yep.
Hi, thank you so much for this session. My name is Jeannie Park. I'm actually the president of the Harvard Asian American Alumni Alliance, and our group also was one of the amici groups that entered the case in favor of affirmative action. And I can talk to any of you chapter and verse about details of the lawsuit if you would like, about the personal rating, which is not a personality rating as the article called it. But what I wanted to ask and say is that I think that, and to respond to the question about being overly obsessed with Harvard, and also the question that the point Rocky was making about movements, is that one of the reasons that this case was brought against Harvard was simply to leverage the name of Harvard and the prestige of Harvard in service of this goal of the man, Edward Bloom, who brought this case, who is very much an anti-affirmative action activist. He is trying to bring down affirmative action throughout the country, and he is using Harvard because he knew that it would be a lightning rod. And I think that we have to try to focus on the movement here, which is the movement against equity for people of color that this is part of. That, Edward Bloom also runs an organization called People for Fair Representation. This is a group that is actively involved in supporting the citizenship question on the census. So the idea that he has brought the suit to help Asian Americans, this is not a man who is a friend of our community. And so I think, again, it's very important to be aware of the larger movements involved here, the larger political movements, and who we are aligned with when we are looking out for ourselves. And so I don't know if any of the panelists, I'm sorry, I went off on my soapbox, but I would respond to that in terms of who do you think about where we're aligned in terms of your positions in this particular case?
Well, I think, Jackie, you want to respond to that, and Nicole can, and then we'll end it and invite you up for a reception where you can ask all the questions that you didn't get to ask. My apologies.
Sure, I can respond.
Yeah.
First, I don't like the way you attack the plaintiff. I think that's not right. What we should look at is the merit of the case, the evidence of the case. Or like I said before, race-based college admission, or you guys call race-based affirmative action, it's a failing policy. It does not help African Americans, does not help Hispanic Americans. So
it helps them in the aggregate, but not in the specific ethnic groups. That's a very important distinction.
Yes, and it harms and it discriminates Asian Americans. So we Asian Americans has to fight our own battle. We have the right to defend equal education rights for our children. That's what I want to say.
So I agree with Jeannie. Ed Blum is a mastermind of trying to roll back civil rights policies, not only in the affirmative action space, but in the voting rights space. He was behind the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, which has had, really dramatic consequences, especially in the South, that we saw in the midterm elections. So I agree that this is a movement issue. I would also acknowledge that Jack is part of a movement that is distinct and separate, though connected to Ed Blum. And I would say that in terms of the movement building aspect, that is why organizations like mine are involved in this. It's not because of a couple of seats at Harvard. It's because we see that if this narrative of Asian Americans as a wedge succeeds, then it is the death of the Rainbow Coalition, which brought about the civil rights movement and all of the changes that we are sort of benefiting from, although many of them have been rolled back. So that's why we're involved in this, because we want to fight back against that narrative and preserve the solidarity that we have with other communities of color.
Thank you.
Can I get 30 seconds?
Yes, 30 seconds.
Two very quick points. One, historically, when you think about the civil rights movement, it happened because they were well-meaning whites who joined hands with blacks, Latinos, and Asians, who said that this was unacceptable and we must change. And with that historical memory, I would urge all of us that this new movement, if we have one, unified or non-unified, to include white as allies, because I have had many white students who came from very modest background, from rural areas. Do they deserve a seat at Harvard or Princeton? Do they bring some form of diversity that the children of two black African-American doctors on the Upper West Side bring? Absolutely. So I think we need a more unifying way of thinking about our country, especially at this particular moment of historical and political polarization and divide. And I don't know how to do that, but I would want all of us to frame our debate in a more unifying way rather than a divisive way. And you see that division already on the stage among our Asian American community alone. So as we think about the future, I hope that we have a better, more integrated, and more just and equal American society as we head forward.
Thank you, Professor. And you did see the division on the stage, but I want to urge you that that's important to see. Because I have been to too many panels where it's just a hallelujah chorus, and those educate very little. And these are the conversations that I think, if anything that comes out of it, is to be engaged and to put on this, voices that are differing. So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you all for coming. I'll see you upstairs on the first floor. We'll all be there. Thank you.